do like to think of the big picture, the matrix and the tapestry. That's my background as a journalist, perhaps, and knowing that everything fits together in a web. And the passion forces me to look deeper and be stiller and wait longer. It's almost like paying homage.
You start out with a real passion for birds, and as you have that passion, you want to learn more about it. You want to learn why things are the way they are and what the interrelationships are between species and the natural world that they live in.
Walking in any part of the natural forest is really enjoyable to me. The natural forest is something that can be marveled at by humans, but can never be improved on by humans.
I like white pine trees too. I think they're quite majestic. And the fact that they get so tall and they can get big and they can be here for a long time, they're monarchs that stand out. They're kind of the pillars of the forest.
Towering pines, shady forests of maple and basswood trees, colorful expanses of prairie flowers and grasses. In Minnesota, nature has given us a splendid home with 3 distinct rooms, 3 living environments that we share with an astounding variety of other beings. This diversity is extraordinary for a non-mountainous state. Minnesota is a meeting place for 3 of North America's major ecological regions, or biomes: the prairie, the deciduous forest, and the coniferous forest. And each of these biomes is tremendously rich and varied in plant and animal life. Minnesota's biological diversity is an outstanding feature of the state's natural heritage. Learning to see Minnesota's lands and waters as a natural home that we share with a host of other beings reveals a fascinating world where humans are intimately linked to the surrounding natural systems. This perspective begins with an understanding of the immense natural forces that have given the landscape its shape and character. In Minnesota, the story of the land begins millions of years ago, when ancient seas covered the state. Sediment accumulating at the bottom of these seas and volcanic activity formed much of our bedrock. The glaciers of the last ice age, rivers of ice a mile thick and more, scraped and gouged the land in some places and deposited elsewhere their loads of rock, sand, gravel, and other soil-forming materials, creating many of the diverse landforms found in Minnesota today. In the 10,000 years that have passed since the glaciers retreated, the vegetation has changed significantly due to variations in precipitation and temperature. First, it became warmer and drier than today, and the prairies advanced to the northeast. Gradually, the climate cooled to Minnesota's present levels, and conifers and northern hardwoods, deciduous forests, and the prairies flourished in the areas where they were found by early European settlers. The changes in vegetation and wildlife that occurred slowly over these many thousands of years during Minnesota's prehistoric era were dramatic. But the arrival of the first Europeans marked the beginning of a new era, in which even greater change was to occur at a much faster pace, affecting each of Minnesota's biomes in its own way.
It must have been like a sea of grass. It must have just gone from where the person was standing all the way to the horizon. And if the wind was blowing, the grass would have been waving and it would have looked just like the surface of the ocean. The prairie flowers are spectacular when you get close to them, but when you look at the prairie from a distance, it just all looks green, and it's because of the grass. The grasses make up 80 to 90% of the plant material on the prairie. So I think the sea of grass is probably a pretty valid description. Well, I remember as a young child my father taking me out on the little prairie remnants that existed along the railroad tracks near home, and we'd always look for pasque flowers and prairie smoke. Those were the earliest of the prairie flowers, and it was always very special to find them. He knew where all those spots were, and I can still go back to those same spots now, but there's no more prairie smoke and no more pasque flowers.
There's something about the landscape, the stretching of it, the horizon, seeing the horizon, kind of lifts the spirit, and it puts me into a really interesting mood. Most people don't like to photograph on the prairie. They don't think of going to the prairie to photograph, and it's a place to me aesthetically that I think I do my greatest work. This is a place on the Blue Mounds. I remember crawling across this very piece of ground when I was early teens, maybe even 10 years old. Very seldom can you capture the atmosphere or wind in a picture, and this does it.
While the windswept prairie once covered about half of Minnesota's land area, today less than 1% remains. Many of the prairie's 150 to 250 native plant species are now rare, mere remnants of a diverse ecosystem dependent upon complex, hidden processes for its regeneration. The rich variety of plants has provided pollen and nectar to thousands of species of insects in a relationship that benefits both. The plants depend on the insects to carry pollen from male to female flowers as part of their reproductive process.
The prairie is based on disturbance. It needs disturbance, several different kinds. Fire is perhaps the most important, but disturbance of the soil by buffaloes where they would wallow, disturbance by pocket gophers, disturbance by badgers digging up pocket gophers. This is all part of the natural history of the prairie.
Of these disturbances, prairie fires played the most important role, whether caused by lightning or set by Native Americans to improve conditions for game. As farmers have long known, fire releases nutrients from dead plant material. While deep root systems protect prairie plants from damage by fires, non-native plants and trees that spread onto the prairie from nearby forests and fields are unable to survive.
And as far as we know, the history of fires in much of Minnesota was that they occurred almost every year, in some cases every other year. And that's very frequent, and that means that these invading plants like willow and aspen wouldn't have much chance to get started. Today, the land managers in the DNR and the Nature Conservancy use fire to remove some of the species that have invaded the prairie. If you would look carefully at both above ground and below ground parts of the prairie, you'd realize that about 80% of the plant material is underground in the root system of the prairie plants. They add to the organic matter in the soil, and that's what's made our prairie soil so rich and black.
This rich prairie soil supports a vast agricultural economy that has played an essential role in feeding a growing nation. But this abundance has come at a cost to Minnesota's prairie ecosystem, which once included millions of acres of wetlands.
Wetlands made it difficult for farming, and the pattern has been for the wetlands to be drained, sometimes by open ditches, sometimes by tile lines. And today, in some counties, especially in the southwestern part of Minnesota, there are no wetlands left, and there would have been thousands of wetlands there during the days before settlement.
The draining and filling of wetlands has destroyed habitat for the many thousands of migratory waterfowl that have relied on prairie wetlands for millennia during their annual transcontinental migrations. The disappearance of wetlands has also accelerated the runoff of rain and melting snow. Draining the land faster has in some cases meant increased flooding and erosion. Jim Vanderpool and his family have worked hard to minimize the negative impacts of their agricultural practices on the land by plowing less intensively and allowing their livestock to forage in the fields of corn and soybeans.
We've been concerned with how the livestock fits with the land, how the farm as a whole fits with the farm family. We've been trying to think of whole things, the whole farm, the whole family in the rural community and the community as a whole, and make the thing all fit together. It's a complicated thing, and it's going to be a lifetime effort. It'd be a lot of blind alleys, and some things aren't going to work out, but we need to try and keep on trying. We have meadowlarks back on the farm again since we've gone away from strictly row cropping, and I hadn't heard larks on the farm since I was a boy. I really realized when I started hearing them again how much I missed them. So all of that is a measure of progress for us.
Other signs of progress can be found in efforts throughout the prairie biome to restore native prairie vegetation and preserve and celebrate precious remnants of Minnesota's sea of grass.
Walking in these woods this morning and hearing the birds, it all comes back as to why you're doing this in the first place and why you're interested. Well, I can remember actually lying on our backs in a deciduous forest along the shores of Lake Michigan, probably 25 years ago now, and it was one of those beautiful spring days that was really the height of the warbler migration. And we just sat there for probably several hours and watched this incredible, colorful array of warblers coming through the woods. And we never had to move, and we counted, I think, upwards of 25 species in this one huge sugar maple tree that was above us.
The fact that Lee Fanmuller's passion for birds has led to a deep appreciation of the deciduous forest is no accident. The forest's exceptional diversity has helped put Minnesota on the map as having one of the highest concentrations of breeding bird populations in North America.
In Minnesota in particular, the eastern deciduous forest is what we call a transitional forest between what was formerly the prairie grasslands in western and southern Minnesota and the more boreal forest in extreme northeastern Minnesota. What happened over the years is a lot of those forests and prairies were converted for different reasons, and what we're seeing today is some dramatic changes in the eastern deciduous forest, largely because of agricultural development and urban development.
The growth of the Twin Cities has had a profound impact on the towering, shady forests of maple and basswoods that were once known as the Big Woods.
I find it magical to walk through a big deciduous forest with these towering maples. I find them haunting. I think that they're kind of lost. When we think of forested country, we think of the North Woods, and maybe not a lot of attention is paid to the deciduous forest. But they're a spectacular piece of our natural heritage, and I'm glad that we have what we have left in Minnesota.
There are very few sites like this. And when you look at the whole Big Woods ecosystem and realize how much of that we've lost, which is almost 99% of it, the importance of this site even elevates higher because there just are very few sites. The Big Woods ecosystem used to cover about 3,400 square miles, and what we have left today is just over a couple thousand acres at best in this part of kind of east central, south central Minnesota. So it's a rare entity indeed. The forests that do remain are becoming more isolated from other forest tracts, and once you decrease the size and you increase the isolation of those forest tracts, you have a profound impact on the species and the natural systems within those woodlots. The birds need a very high protein diet to feed their young, who grow very rapidly in a short period of time. And they derive that protein largely by eating what we call lepidopteran larvae, which are the larvae of butterflies and moths. Well, those larvae also spend all their time during the summer eating the leaves of the trees and the shrubs in the forest so that they can turn into a butterfly or moth adult stage.
Declining bird populations in fragmented forests result in more insects eating the leaves of the remaining trees. and these become less healthy. Also, fragmentation from development allows easier access for non-native species of plants that can disturb the forest ecosystem, and for new kinds of predators.
As we have more people living closer to woods, we have a lot of free-ranging cats, and there have been some estimates that house cats are responsible for millions and millions of songbird deaths each year.
Sprawling housing developments contribute significantly to the fragmentation of the deciduous forest by opening up forested areas for homes and new roads. But there are creative alternatives. Laura Lee DiLorenzo and her family are building a new home 40 miles from the Twin Cities in a development that's designed to minimize fragmentation while creating a strong social community.
Jackson Meadows is kind of a unique development. Their hope is that by having the same amount of land that you might have in any development, by clustering the homes on just 40% of it and leaving the rest of it open land that everyone has access to, then everybody has access to a lot of territory.
Developments like Jackson Meadow, which preserve most of the land and use only native plants and trees for new landscaping, retain a balance between development and preservation of green space. These and other solutions, such as preserving public spaces as parks and natural areas, are critically important in the effort to reduce fragmentation of the fast disappearing deciduous forest.
Pines are beautiful, listening to the wind blowing through the white pine branches.
The wolf represents the wilderness to me. If it were the West, it'd be the grizzly bear. Large predators that are still roaming free, doing their thing, tells me that it's a relatively healthy ecosystem, and I just need to be close to that.
Grandfather came to northern Minnesota right after the turn of the century and worked in the woods, and my father did as well, and now my generation and my sons and nephews are in this business.
Minnesotans share an affection for the tall pines, birch, and aspens that evoke for us the mystique of the coniferous biome, a mystique that is deepened by the region's extensive peatlands and bogs, legendary lakes and river systems, and its elusive wildlife.
There's a really special relationship between the wolf and the raven that I've watched and studied intensely over the years. They spend a lot of time together. There's kind of a love-hate relationship. I've come to the conclusion that the raven actually has a word. Of their 250 vocalizations that science has proven, I've come to the conclusion of recognizing the vocalization that means wolf in raven talk.
For thousands of years, the richness and diversity of life in Minnesota's northern forests and wetlands has been maintained through complex processes set in motion by fundamental forces such as fire, wind, and light. For example, in the aftermath of a major forest fire or windstorm that clears the land of most older trees, a young forest develops of sunlight-loving, fast-growing aspen and birch. These pioneer tree species are often so successful they create a dense canopy that is too shady for their own offspring. More shade-tolerant balsam fir, cedar, and white spruce grow in the shadows of the pioneers. Fires occurring in the passing decades stimulate growth of the fire-resistant white, red, and jack pine, which eventually dominate the forest. Throughout this process, debris from dead and fallen trees lying on the forest floor encourages growth by providing nutrients for the soil. Traditionally, humans have played a role in this process as well.
In the past, before the Europeans got here, before there were white people on this continent, the Indians would burn off large areas of fire.
Kurt Gagnon's observations of the coniferous biome have come through experience as a commercial fisherman, logger, and natural resource manager.
They wouldn't be controlled burns, they would be just areas that they felt had to be taken care of so that it would produce berries, which they depended upon. It would open up the area so that small game and large game would move into the area. It would become great habitat for the wildlife.
But the human role in the coniferous biome changed abruptly about 150 years ago with the arrival of European immigrants equipped with saws and a different perspective toward the woods. Jack Ryola's ancestors were among those drawn to Minnesota's North Country by the promise of the forest's bounty.
With the extensive logging that was done in the 1800s and up until the beginning of the 20th century, essentially everything was cut in Minnesota. And that was about the time that my grandfather showed up on the scene. And really the only forests that were left at that time were just remnants.
Today, in Minnesota, biological diversity has been significantly reduced. Acre upon acre of single species, same-aged trees are now harvested for production of pulp and paper products. While the forest industry contributes importantly to the state's economy, simplifying the mix of trees in the forest has eliminated habitat for a variety of plant and animal life.
The future of our business really is dependent upon what we do in the forest today. And we found white pine an exciting part of that.
Jack Ryola's family logging operation maintains mixed forests on about 60% of their lands. They're also working hard to bring back a species that has had a difficult time recovering since the state was first logged over.
White pine, it's an important species for neotropical birds, deep woods birds, of course eagles and osprey favor white pine for a nest and roost.
Encouraging diversity in the forest by allowing mixed species of trees to grow to maturity can help mend tears that have occurred in the fabric of the coniferous biome. So can the practice of setting aside important landscapes for generations yet to come.
I guess the most important thing that I would want to pass on to future generations is something that we did in Grand Portage, and that was to create or produce a land use plan. There were areas that we wanted to protect and preserve for future generations, and we set those aside in our land use plan, our zoning ordinance, as preservation areas. It gives us a contact with our past, and it also tells us that this can be saved for the future.
Every day you find a little nuance that you didn't know before, and it's like discovering a whole new mountain range. I'll go back early in the morning and I'll see something I've never seen before, a species of bird or a tree that's either dying or a new flower, and it's just very exhilarating. These little discoveries, to me, are what I live for.
Life is a circle, so it is with the forest. Life in the forest begins over, and it's the same way for the creatures that depend on new habitat. The circle of life is the same for wildlife, just as it is for plants and just as it is for humans.
We are as much members of the natural communities surrounding us as we are part of the social communities that we're more familiar with. It's up to all of us to leave behind the boundaries that have too narrowly defined our sense of home. The time has come to get to know Minnesota's natural landscapes, to understand how they function and what they need to survive, to discover how we can best live as neighbors to the prairies and forests that have for so long made Minnesota a great place to live.